good evening, and welcome to our second session of the three-part webinar series that we are doing on carbon credits. Let me just give a quick recap to those who weren't able to attend our last session. In our last session, had started with the backdrop of the commitments made by India at COP26 on the goal for achieving net zero by 2070. We explained how the term carbon neutrality is sometimes used interchangeably with net zero and how experts differentiate that. We discussed the concept of carbon credits and how they work. We also analyzed significant markers of international actions, including starting with the Kyoto Protocol. We touched upon the Doha Amendment and the status quo under the Paris Agreement. On the Indian front, we analyzed the existing energy schemes and incentives, explained the carbon credit trading scheme rolled out in India, which is, I think most of you all would know about it, which is the RPOs and RECs, and the PAT schemes and the e-certs. Today, the idea is to take that discussion further and understand what carbon markets are and how they work in detail. Before I start, a quick introduction to the firm, the panelists. We're the same set of people who were there the last time around. My name is Praveen Raju, and I'm one of the founding partners of Spiceroot Legal. I lead the alternative energy and sustainability practice, and I also head the corporate M&A and private equity practice. Our firm, Spiceroot Legal, we do have a very sector-focused approach. And one of the sectors that we look at is, of course, alternative energy, as you would have understood. We do a wide variety of work in that space, ranging from we don't do the traditional oil and gas work. We don't do much of it. And I think the world has changed as well. I think that a lot of the work that we do is more renewable energy and alternative energy. We've seen a shift from the amount of work that we were doing at one point of time was more solar and wind focused, but that has shifted over the course of the years, where we see a lot more work in hydrogen, in biofuels, in storage. We've also been working with a lot of clients across the various initiatives by the government and the tenders which have come out by the government across all of these. Let me hand it over to my panelists, Janhavi and Amoolya, to just quickly introduce themselves as well, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Praveen. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your participation in this webinar, which is part 2 in our series of 3 sessions. I'm Janhavi, a renewable energy and sustainability lawyer and a senior associate at Spiceroot Legal. I work with renewable energy projects and technology companies in their efforts to build a sustainable future. And I look forward to having some insightful discussions with you through the course of this webinar today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Amoolya Khurana. I'm a senior associate with the Alternative Energy, Sustainability and Mobility team at Spiceroot Legal. I work primarily in the traditional energy sector on solar and wind power projects.
Yeah, so that's traditional for Amoolya. Thanks, Janhavi and Amoolya. Let me get kick-started. Just before I start, there is a Q&A box. So if you'd like to post questions as we go along, please feel free to do so. If we have questions as we are progressing through the session, we'll pause, we'll take your questions. If there aren't too many, then we'll probably do it at the end of the webinar, but please feel free to kind of post your questions. Okay. This is the agenda. Very quickly, what we're going to cover. We're going to cover an overview of the carbon markets, classification based on mechanisms, classification based on compliance obligations, and classification based on development stages. And of course, finally, future outlook. We will also touch upon, give you some examples of markets which are there across the world. We're not going to touch upon India today. That's going to be in the next session, but we'll give you an overview of the markets, some of the markets that are prevalent in the world today. So let's start off with, what are carbon markets? As the name suggests, the carbon market is a marketplace where one can buy and sell carbon credits and make the reduction, removal, or allowance of emissions a tradable asset. It can be classified, the carbon markets can be classified based on different categories and criteria, like the nature of obligation, mechanisms used for generating carbon credits, or the stages of the life cycle of carbon credits. First, as a starting point, let's start the discussion off with the classification based on various mechanisms. There are two which we believe are the mechanisms. One is, of course, the allowance of emissions mechanism, or what is known as the ETS or cap and trade systems. The other is the reduction or removal emissions mechanism, which is known as the offsets approach or the baseline and credit mechanism. A very quick brief before Amoolya jumps into the details. Under the first one, which is the allowance of emissions and ETS or cap and trade system, carbon emission allowances for domestic firms and sectors are issued by regional, national, and international government organizations. These allowances mandate a maximum amount of CO2 that holders are permitted to emit. Each allowance typically allows its owner to emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. Where an entity is within the caps that are permitted, it is allowed to trade the excess. Similarly, those that cross those limits are either are able to buy from the others in the secondary market or pay a penalty for the excess. Kyoto Protocol's IET mechanism adopted this approach. Many countries have also adopted cap and trade systems to develop their domestic carbon markets. Now let's look at the removal or reduction of emissions, which is the offset approach or the baseline and credit system. In this system, emission reductions or removals are measured with a reference to a hypothetical baseline emission that would have been generated in the absence of the proposed green project. Generated credits might either be consumed by the producer, by the developer, or sold to another entity that are required to balance out their carbon footprint. And Kyoto Protocol CDM developed this approach and is currently being used under Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement as well. Now I'll hold on to how do these mechanisms work. I think that Amoolya will kind of get into the details and explain this. Amoolya, over.
Right. So thank you for the introduction and the brief on the emissions trading system, Praveen. As we've just explained, this system sets carbon caps for a sector, and the market is where allowances are traded. So the first question that arises, obviously, is how do you set a cap? The cap can be set in one of two ways, the top-down approach or the bottom-up approach. Now, in a top-down approach, the government sets very high-level caps based on its overall emission reduction objectives, based on a very high-level assessment of mitigation potential and costs. For example, if the government were to have an emission reduction objective of, say, 100 units, it would then split the objective across 4 sectors, 40, 30, 20, and 10, to lead to an overall 100. Now, this is exactly what was done in the Kyoto Protocol, where Annex 1 countries were given hard targets, which they then split across sectors. Now, a top-down approach makes inherent sense since it is aligned with the overall mitigation objective of a country, which is exactly what the nationally determined contribution is under the Paris Agreement. As opposed to the top-down approach, the bottom-up approach is more customized caps. This is based on a more granular assessment of emissions, mitigation potential, as well as costs. Now, this bottom-up approach is what was used in phase 1 and phase 2 of the EU ETS. Now, once the cap is set, either using this top-down or bottom-up approach, it is revised periodically and reduced, resulting in a gradual reduction in the level of emissions. You can either do a single high-level cap for all sectors, which is what the EU ETS does, or you can do sector-specific caps. Now, the cap itself does not represent tradable assets. So the government creates allowances which represent the emissions which are allowed under the cap. Now, these allowances can either be obtained for free or purchased through an auction system or a combination of both systems. In the free allocation mechanism, energy-intensive industries are given allowances for free, whereas in the auctioning mechanism, allowances which are not allocated for free are auctioned on a platform. Participation for the auction system can be open to obligated entities and can also be open to non-obligated entities. The auctioning mechanism represents a great opportunity to raise funds, and we know this because in 2022, approximately 63 billion USD was raised through auctioning allowances. Now, this was made up of funds raised by the EU ETS, the UK ETS, and the German ETS. Now, caps are set, allowances are distributed, and your compliance cycle commences and finishes. At the end of all of this, allowances need to be surrendered or retired. Very briefly put, at the end of an emission reduction cycle, each company to whom these caps were given must hold allowances equal to its actual emissions during that period. Now, a company that emits less than its annual allowances can sell the excess on the market, and a company that emits more than the allowances that it holds will have to purchase additional allowances from the market, or may even have to pay a penalty. Companies can also bank excess allowances in a year for use in a following period of time. The last concept in the ETS that we have to discuss is price discovery for allowances. There are again various factors that influence price discovery, but briefly, it's supply and demand, fluctuations in supply and demand, and also technology cost trends. To counter these fluctuations, you could introduce a floor and a ceiling price, which serves as a safety valve within the ETS, and this is what was done by the California ETS. Now, let's look at a hypothetical example of an ETS to understand all the concepts that we've just discussed. We'll begin with the cap, which in this case is 500 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, company A's actual emissions are 1,000, which it reduces by 200 to reach 800 units. Now, it's done that reduction through installation of carbon capture technology. Now, it reaches 800, which are its total emissions for that period. Like we discussed, it needs 800 allowances under the ETS to match its total emissions. Now, in order to reach that 800 number, company A uses various methods to gather these allowances, which include, in this case, buying allowances at auction, which combined with its free allowances, give it 500 allowances. This amount and the 300 allowances that it buys at the market means that at the end of the compliance cycle, its actual emissions are 800 units. Its allowances are also 800, meaning that it's in compliance and does not incur a penalty. To summarize, the principal objective of an ETS is to encourage the reduction of emissions by putting a price on carbon. It's about making sure that if an entity is emitting carbon dioxide, it should pay for the right to do so, converting the right to emit carbon dioxide into a commodity. If the cost of allowances is sufficiently high, then those people who are responsible for emitting that carbon dioxide will have a financial incentive to reduce their emissions by introducing energy efficient technology or by in other ways becoming energy efficient, rather than simply buying allowances in the market or under the auction system. Now, given this objective, ETSs can be significant in shaping climate policy, driving emissions reductions through a marketplace-based approach, encouraging international cooperation, and also obviously generating revenue. Over to Janhavi now, who will be discussing the offset approach.
Thank you, Amoolya. Now, on the offset approach, unlike cap and trade, like Amoolya discussed, where the targets are already provided, the target under offset is basically called baseline, which is determined by the party. So it's not upfront offered or determined. It has to be determined by the parties involved. And we'll go on to see how. So a carbon offset refers to reduction in greenhouse gas emissions or an increase in carbon storage that is then used to compensate for emissions that occur elsewhere. So the way this works is because obviously greenhouse gases emissions, gases mix globally in the atmosphere. It does not matter where they are reduced. If I have implemented a technology or an activity to reduce emissions, and so then I can offset the carbon emissions here into another activity that may generate emissions. That is the high level understanding of a carbon offset. A carbon offset credit, on the other hand, is a transferable instrument like a credit certified by governments or independent certification bodies to represent an emission reduction through the offset mechanism of 1 metric ton of CO2. So essentially, to gear up a carbon offset project, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with which includes projects like use of renewable energy, capture of high potency greenhouse gases like HFCs or methane, or reforestation activities. Now let's take an example because this may be a little confusing. Uh, let's say there's a steel manufacturing unit and they want to develop a project to utilize green hydrogen instead of gray hydrogen, which will obviously result in a reduction of GHG. And this activity will result in a carbon offset because, like we understood, it will reduce in the GHG emissions. This activity can be used, this emission reduction can be used by the developer or by any other entity to undertake carbon emitting activities elsewhere. Now, clearly, carbon offset credits are not a simple commodity. It's quite complex. That's maybe precisely the reason why we have 3 webinars to discuss this. There are standard setting organizations to provide quality assurance for carbon offsets, such as the United Nations CDM, Clean Development Mechanism, which oversees carbon offsets under the Kyoto Protocol, to other independent non-governmental organizations. Each carbon offset program issues its own label or brand of credit. For example, the carbon offset issued under the CDM is known as CER, Certified Emission Reduction, while the carbon offset generated and issued under the Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement is referred to as A6.4 ERs. So each program issues their own instrument, which is labeled or branded in a certain way. Now, how do you calculate the carbon offset, or how does this calculation work? To understand this, it is critical to get to know the concept of baseline in the offset mechanism. If you recollect, I started by saying that baseline is determined by the parties involved. Why do I say that? That's because baseline is essentially calculated by defining the expected level of greenhouse gas emissions that would have occurred had the project developer not implemented that project. So if the steel manufacturing unit had not started using green hydrogen technology, what would be the level of carbon dioxide emission into the environment is what is referred to as the baseline. Now, the difference between this baseline level of emissions in the absence of this green hydrogen technology and the reduced emissions in the scenario where the green hydrogen technology is in fact implemented results in the issuance of carbon credits to the developer, whoever is implementing the project. And the baseline actually determines how many carbon credits will then be given to the developer. Again, making it simpler in the example we took earlier, if the introduction of green hydrogen technology in a steel manufacturing unit was not there, the project would not have been developed, the emissions would, let's take 3,000 tons of carbon dioxide. With the introduction of this green technology, the emissions are reduced to 1,500 tons of carbon dioxide. So the credits that can be issued are up to 1,500, which is 3,000 minus 1,500, 1,500 tons of carbon, 1,500 tons of carbon dioxide, right? That's how the emission and the carbon offset credits work. Now, in order for us to generate the carbon offset for any developer, there is a rigorous process to ensure that real quantifiable emission reductions have been achieved. And for that, a developer has to go through multiple processes and a rigorous process to ensure that it is done in a very transparent manner. So it starts with a project idea where the developer decides on what that project activity is going to be, how to implement it, what are the feasibility and viability considerations, what are the risks that will impact the project, and it may include engaging with some local stakeholders. Now, after the project ideation stage, there's a document called the project design document that needs to be developed, which will contain all the basic information about the project, such as the objective, the location, when and how will the project be implemented, the duration, what will be the development of baseline, how is the baseline going to be calculated, the monitoring method, and all of that. All of this information will go into the document, which is the PDD. Once this is done, independent accredited auditors will examine the document and the information it contains. You could, approach various verification and validation bodies for the validation process here, and they validate and audit the baseline methodology, the monitoring process that is going to be implemented to really verify if the baseline that you've taken, the way you want to monitor it, or the way the carbon offsets will be generated and offset makes complete, adheres to the process laid out or not. Once the validation is completed, the project can be registered with a regulatory body or under a voluntary standard such as gold standard or VERA. We'll come to what these mean. Once the registration is then was completed, then comes the monitoring phase where the project has been implemented, has been commissioned, and the actual emissions according to the approved methodology is being controlled and is being calculated. Then at the end of each monitoring phase, a validation and verification body assesses whether the values that we set out to contribute and achieve from the project is being actually achieved or not, and if it is being verified in the monitoring report. Once the verification is complete and there is in fact confirmation that the emissions are being reduced with the technology that was implemented in the manner the project developer set out to, the issuance of carbon offsets happen. And this could be, like I said, CER or A6.4 ERs, etc., etc. And after this carbon offset is issued and used or consumed by a consumer, it has to be retired, like Amoolya mentioned, under the ETS mechanism, right? The retirement is also noted in that relevant registry, and then it can't be traded again. Otherwise, it will lead into an issue called double counting, which Praveen will take us through. Now, this brings me to the pricing mechanism, very similar to the financial market. The supply and demand of carbon credits really determine the pricing of carbon credits. The supply is really called out by the investments, by the investors or project developers who are willing to put in the capital in developing renewable energy, green technology products and projects, right? And the demand side of it comes from companies that have emission reduction targets to meet, either under a compulsory market or voluntarily because of the commitments that they have made and they have pledged themselves towards. And this quantum of demand and supply of emission reduction credits determines the supply of carbon in the offset markets. Now, after understanding the offset market and all about carbon credits as a tool to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, how do we feel about how do we feel about carbon credits as a tool to reduce GHG, right? Because I say this because there are quite a few environment advocates who have raised concerns, and there is enough that is said in the recent past about the environmental integrity issues around carbon credits. What I mean by environmental integrity of carbon credits here is really the credibility, reliability, and effectiveness of the emission reductions or removals that are achieved through carbon offset projects. Because initially when I explained, I said that if you implement a technology to reduce emissions, you can continue to make, you can continue to have carbon emitting activities elsewhere because they mix globally in the air. So there are concerns raised about, does it really address the core of the issue, which is all industries or all individuals trying to strive to implement technologies that will reduce emissions at a global level, right? Instead of industries making transparent and earnest efforts to put in the money and make capital investment towards reducing carbon footprint, offset offers a platform where they can continue to emit, but then, decide to plant some trees or engage in any other carbon reduction efforts. So I guess the discussion around quality of carbon credits and the environmental integrity issues is an important topic that we would like to address. Praveen, do you have some additional thoughts to share on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, there's a huge discussion and debate across, the voluntary market as to the quality of carbon offsets. And that's something, I'll touch upon while we get into the conclusion. But before that, just to understand what is quality and how is that, how do you call a carbon offset credit as a quality carbon offset credit, right? So the fundamental concept of a carbon offset is its ability to act as a substitute for GHG emission reductions that an entity would have achieved independently. Therefore, a carbon credit must result in a benefit as if the entity had reduced its own carbon footprint. The term quality in relation to a carbon offset credit refers to the degree of confidence in meeting this fundamental principle. It can be characterized, I think, by two factors. One is, of course, the offset credit must represent a genuine and additional reduction or removal of at least 1 metric ton of CO2, which is permanent in nature and not already claimed elsewhere. And two, a quality offset credit should originate from activities that do not cause other social or environmental harm. And these two criteria, I think that I can further summarize it into certain things that need to be kept in mind when we kind of look at these two criteria and these two factors, right? One is additionality. The element of additionality means that the project would not have happened in business as usual scenario in the absence of that funding provided by the carbon credit scheme. Similarly, there's also this whole confusion around overestimation of emissions. I mean, this is specifically in the case of baseline emissions, where there is an overestimation, and therefore, when it's actually only 50 additional tons of carbon that are reduced by an offset project, the overestimation says that it is 100, and therefore there are 50 additional carbon credits which have been issued, which in its true sense is not actually reducing the carbon emissions. And I think that, in addition to that, I think that there is what is called as permanence, because most of the projects are long-term projects. And in long-term projects, it is important to ensure and guarantee that the emission mitigation is not for a short period, but for the term of the project. And of course, double counting, as the term suggests, it should not be that two entities are counting the same offsets. An example of this would be where, there's a producer of and consumer of biofuels. Both the producer as well as the consumer is accounting for this, and there are offset credits which have been issued to both of them. So these are some of the factors that you need to keep in mind when you're looking at quality. And I think that we've covered what the mechanisms are. Now let's move on to the next stage where we kind of distinguish it based on the basis of compliance. Based on what is compliance, what is the compliance market, and what is the voluntary market. Amoolya, do you want to kind of step into this?
Right. So thank you, Praveen. We'll begin with regulated or compliance markets, which are also known as mandatory markets or compulsory markets. And these emanate from legal mechanisms. For example, the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Agreement, or domestic legislations, rules, and regulations. Now, this market imposes mandatory obligations on carbon-intensive industries to limit their greenhouse gas emissions. And these obligated entities are required by law to meet preset carbon reduction targets and consequently also undertake trading of carbon credits. We'll specifically discuss a few examples of compliance markets. We will discuss the EU ETS, which is a compliance market based on the cap and trade mechanism, as well as the China ETS, which is also a compliance market, but it's based on the baseline and credit mechanism, which is what we understand the Indian carbon compliance market will also be based on. Now, on the EU ETS, few things to know. First, caps are set for 3 different GHG emissions, namely carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and perfluorocarbons for specific activities. The second thing to know is that allowances are the currency of the EU ETS, and each allowance is equal to 1 ton of carbon dioxide or the equivalent amount of 2 other greenhouse gases. Now, companies can receive some allowances from the government for free, and to cover the rest of their emissions, they need to either buy additional allowances, or they can obviously also use any surplus allowances that they have saved from previous years. Now, since 2013, auctioning has been the primary method for allocating emissions allowances, and EU ETS auctions are conducted daily. Within limits, companies can also buy credits from certain approved emission reduction saving projects from across the world. In terms of compliance, there is obviously a monitoring and reporting procedure, which is required to be complied with by operators. There are also third-party verifiers for verifications of emissions and allowances. Now, allowances have to be used and surrendered for emissions in the previous year. And if you fail to surrender adequate allowances, you incur penalties, which can be a fine for any excess greenhouse gas which is emitted, and also the requirement to purchase additional allowances to cover that shortfall that you've incurred. On trading, it can be done directly or through intermediaries also. And anyone who has an account in the union registry can buy or sell allowances, whether or not they're a company covered by the EU ETS. For 2024, in terms of numbers, the overall cap on all installations is 1,386 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. And for the aviation sector, it is 28.9 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. We'll move on to the second example of the ETS now, which is the China ETS. First thing to know again is that it's new and obviously consequently not all that sophisticated. In comparison to the EU ETS, the China ETS only covers carbon dioxide emissions. And secondly, it also does not set out sectoral caps, but uses an emission intensity-based benchmarking system to set caps for individual entities. Allowances are currently being distributed for free and then adjusted in consequent years based on actual production. And as on date, there's no auction mechanism, obviously, but there are talks to possibly introduce one in the coming years. Similar to the EU ETS, there are monitoring, verification, reporting procedures, and trading takes place on the Shanghai Environment and Energy Exchange. And what is being traded is called a China Emissions Allowance, or a CEA. That's it on examples of compliance markets. But before we move on to voluntary markets, I think Praveen wants to discuss an industry-specific compliance market.
Thanks, Amoolya. Yeah, I just wanted to touch upon this while we've looked at, when we started off on compliance market, the presumption is that it's always driven by nations and, states specifically, but there is also sector specific ones. And I think this is the one which is the most well-known, which is specifically with respect to the aviation sector, what is called as CORSIA, or the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. So in October 2016, the member states of International Civil Aviation Organization adopted a global market-based measure for aviation emissions, which is CORSIA. And this aims to reduce aviation emissions through the application of climate-sensitive measures, etc. As of now, I think there are 126 states which are participating in CORSIA. How does CORSIA work? So CORSIA applies specifically to airlines, and it falls, if those airlines fall within a particular criteria. There's also phases in which they are implementing this. When it comes to the eligibility criteria, it applies to only international flights, which will take off from one state and land in another. And domestic flights don't come into the purview of CORSIA. The weight of the aircraft when takeoff should be more than a particular amount, which is, if I'm not mistaken, 5,700 kilograms. The annual emission of the aircraft is greater than 10,000 metric tons of CO2. All states, regardless of whether they are participating in the phases, I'll come to the phases separately, but regardless of whether they're participating in the phase or not, are required to report CO2 emissions on an annual basis, with monitoring which started in 2019, in January 2019. CO2 emissions are effectively calculated based on the fuel use. As a rule, it is actual fuel use on each individual international flight which is used, but then there are simplified monitoring mechanisms as well. The phases, now going into the phases of application, the phases of application are twofold. The first phase is again split into two, which was 2021 to 2023, which is called the pilot phase. And the first phase, immediate following phase, was called the first phase, which is from 2024 to 2026. The pilot and the first phases were strictly voluntary. The offsetting requirements were only to apply to those states who have volunteered to participate in these two phases. However, the annual monitoring and reporting and verification requirements were applicable to all participant states. And the only distinction between the pilot phase and the first phase was that in the pilot phase, the states had the option to determine the baseline for their offsetting requirements. As against the first phase, which is 2024 to 2026, the calculation is dependent on mandatory based emissions for each year. So there are emission thresholds which are given for each year. The second phase starts from 2027 and is on till 2035. The offsetting requirements will apply to all international flights, including those that did not volunteer to be part of the first phase. The exceptions to that are only flights which take off to and fro from least developed countries, small island developing states, landlocked developing countries, etc. But even there, these exempted states can volunteer to participate in the second phase offsetting requirements. Now, what is India's perspective on CORSIA? Even though India is a member, it is not participating in the voluntary phase. It will only have to comply from 2027, which is the mandatory phase from 2027 onwards. This is largely, I'm sure, as you're all aware, to kind of ensure that the airlines in India get time to grow and do not face any financial consequences because of CORSIA non-compliance. However, as mandated by CORSIA, India has been making annual reports detailing CO2 emissions through the Ministry of Aviation, as we are a member state of the ICAO. There have been various steps taken by the ministry as well as the airline operators to prepare ourselves for reducing aviation emission. The most well-known, of course, being the blending of ATF with cleaner fuels. The MOPNG came out with, constituted the Bioaviation Turbine Fuel Program, which was intended to promote the use of clean fuel and blending. And in fact, I think it was SpiceJet in 2018, which had conducted a demonstration flight where they had used biofuel blended with ATF in one engine. There's a lot of sensitization by the Ministry of Civil Aviation and the DGCA with regular meetings with Indian carriers to lay down the groundwork for implementation of CORSIA. It's not only the airline carriers which can kind of reduce emissions, it's also technology innovation within the Airports Authority and all of the operators who have a part to play in aviation. So, there is a manual which is called as the Flexible Use of Airspace Manual, which came out, which was a mechanism to try and reduce carbon emissions in the aviation sector. There is a management technique which has been adopted by the Airports Authority of India to manage, which is called the Central Air Traffic Flow Management Systems, which are to manage air traffic flows strategically in the Indian sky, which ensures that there are reduced delays and optimization of capacity and holding, etc. Then there are navigation systems, which there's a performance-based navigation system which has helped in optimizing track miles, descent and climb profiles, and all of that. So all of these are initiatives by the government to kind of ensure that the airlines in India are prepared for complying with CORSIA and the reporting requirements and reduction of emissions in the aviation sector. So that's a very sector-specific compliance mechanism. Now we move on to, of course, we touched upon the compliance market. We'll move into the voluntary market, and Janvi can kind of explain the voluntary market in detail.
Sure. Thank you, Praveen. We've looked at the compliance obligations, splitting the markets into compulsory and voluntary, and compulsory has been discussed in detail, compliance based. Now, on the voluntary market bit, it is essentially driven by private entities rather than legal mechanisms, right? In this market, project developers develop emission reduction or removal projects to generate offsets that can be bought by buyers looking to meet voluntary targets, and the offsets that are certified by third-party certifying entities like Gold Standard and Vera, etc. They are they're driven by their CSR goals or resulting emission reductions and removals, which are referred to as voluntary emission reductions. Now, the global voluntary carbon credit market consists of various fragmented independent players. However, it is dominated by two entities, names of which I've been using a lot in this session: Gold Standard and Vera, which is Verified Carbon Standard. Vera is the NGO that has initiated the Verified Carbon Standard. First off, Vera is this non-profit organization which developed and continues to manage this comprehensive carbon offset program called VCS, which is operational on a global scale and very popular with many project developers and offset buyers. It specifically focuses on attributes related to GHG reduction and does not extend to projects that have other environmental or social benefits. Greenhouse gas emission reduction, that's it. VCS is governed by three key bodies: the Program Advisory Group, the Vera Board, and Technical Advisory Groups. On the other hand, Gold Standard, GS. Now, this is a voluntary carbon offset program that focuses on advancing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It is applicable to both voluntary offset projects and CDM projects under the United Nations framework. It has a specific emphasis on projects that deliver not only environmental GHG reduction benefits, but also long-term social, economic, and environmental advantages, which is different from what we saw for Vera, right? This was introduced in 2003, and the Gold Standard CDM was introduced in 2003, and the VER as an instrument was established in 2006. It operates under the authority of the Technical Governance Committee and the Gold Standard auditors. Now, when comparing Vera, VCS, and Gold Standard, there are certain notable differences that stand out. One, of course, being the scope or the diverse range of projects that both programs focus on. One being specifically GHG, and the other, which is Gold Standard, focusing on other social, environmental, and other economic benefits. The other is that Vera offers a more efficient verification process, resulting in faster project validation. That's because their processes are not so strict. Gold Standard follows a more rigorous verification process, so the timeline may look slightly more lengthier. And as a result of that, costs are typically lower in the Vera VCS program, whereas the upfront costs for gold standard are comparatively higher given the rigorous process that I mentioned. Now, if you were a, a voluntary, if you are a business looking to enter into the voluntary offset market, and you're confused between which program to look after, it both are reputable voluntary carbon standards, no doubt. They enable companies to offset their carbon emissions and support global climate efforts in a superb manner. But the decision between these two standards really hinges on a company's requirements, priorities, costs, and the nature of the carbon offset projects, right? Um, so we're done with the regulatory and voluntary markets. Now, the other classification of carbon markets that we would like to move on to is based on the life cycle of a carbon credit, which is a primary carbon market and a secondary carbon market. Primary market is where carbon credits or offsets are initially issued and traded. That's the origin of the offset. It involves the distribution of allowances or the credits by the issuer. If it is a compliance method, then we know that it's a government or a regulatory body, or if it is a voluntary, then we know it's one of the gold or Vera standards, right? So where the distribution of the allowances occur from the origin is comes under the primary market. It could also be generation of carbon offsets through emission reduction projects and their sale of the credits from a project developer to buyers such as governments or individuals in the compulsory or voluntary market. Now, on the other hand, the secondary carbon market is where already issued carbon credits or carbon offsets in the primary market are bought and sold, similar to stocks or commodities or other financial instruments among market participants, including companies, investors, individual investors, etc. This provides liquidity and flexibility for market participants to manage their carbon portfolios, accumulate any surplus allowances, or offset for future use. So you can really hinge upon the benefit of the ups and downs in the carbon markets as a financial player in the secondary market. It could be done on an exchange or over the counter through spot derivative contracts, etc. Other than the primary and secondary markets, I would also like to just briefly discuss a contractual document between a buyer and a seller looking to purchase emission reduction purchase agreement in a legally binding contract, which is called an ERPA, emission reduction purchase agreement. We've worked on something like this for a large oil company, and it was a supremely technical document. We thoroughly enjoyed figuring out the details of this document, but it's very uniquely tailored to the requirements of the project. The one that we helped with was for carbon credits to be generated or offsets to be generated through installation of biodigesters in the farms of Punjab in India. And this oil company was based out of Singapore. So the oil company was purchasing the offsets from the developer in Punjab, the farmers in Punjab. And why I say it's technical and slightly complex is because there are situations where the developer wants to retain some of the credits, and the rest are then traded or sold under the ERPA. So we need to go into the technicalities of how it is calculated. In this case, it was validated and registered with gold standard, if I recollect correctly. So we had to look at the process of the gold standard for verification, calculation, retirement, etc. A very fun document to work on, honestly. There are other details like, you kind of end up specifying the risk of what happens if the carbon offsets are not generated. How do you allocate the risk between the buyer and the purchaser in such instances? What kind of quantity and price of carbon for the carbon offsets has been legislated? What are the payment schedules, etc., etc. Now, this concludes our discussion on the carbon markets based on the various classifications, the mechanisms, the origin, the compulsory obligations, etc. And I want to take a minute to just pause and consider all of that we've discussed so far to answer a simple question, that is, what does the future look like for carbon markets, right? Unlike financial markets, carbon markets are relatively new. and only a few decades old, the adoption of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that was held in 1992 in Rio was really where the compliance markets began this push that represented global awareness and efforts for combating climate change. I would say since then, a lot has been done at a global level. We see efforts being taken at an international level for combating climate change. It has been the talk of the town. Everyone is doing their bit to really implement efforts. Um, and the development of an international compliance market from the Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement has pushed for the development of smaller national, regional level compliance markets to achieve the targets that are set at an international level. And therefore, somewhere I believe that the compliance market's role is indispensable to, continue pushing all of the other participants, all of the nations and other regional fragments to be more ambitious about setting and achieving their climate change goals. Amoolya, Praveen, do you have anything to add on how does the future look like for carbon markets?
Thanks, Janhavi. Amoolya, you want to go first? And I think we have some questions as well, so we'll address those questions, but we'll just quickly conclude and then we can just jump onto the question.
Yes, 2 points, both on things that I'm sure all of us are looking forward to. On the international front, possible regulations and rules on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, hopefully in the next few months, because COP29 will be held in November 2024 in Baku. On the domestic front, given the current information that's come out in the budget and the finance minister's speech, looking forward to the Indian government transitioning from their energy efficiency targets under the PAT scheme to more rigorous emission reduction targets under the carbon credit trading scheme. And also, we'll probably witness the implementation of the detailed procedure for compliance mechanism under the CCTS, which was very recently issued by the Bureau of Energy Efficiency.
Thanks, Amoolya. So let me also just quickly that I go back to what I kind of spoke about earlier, which is on high quality carbon credits. And I think that there's been a lot of intense scrutiny on the with respect to the voluntary markets on the ethicality of offset projects that generate carbon credits. So in recent times, we've heard of a lot of allegations that more than 90% of the rainforest carbon offsets by Vera were practically worthless. And in fact, due to those allegations, there was a very large carbon offset player who had to abandon their project in Zimbabwe. But does that mean that voluntary markets are not worth the investment? I don't think so. I think that I was in fact listening to, I don't know if you've heard of this person, Spencer Mayer, who's part of B0 Carbon, which is a carbon credit rating agency, who said that he doesn't appreciate the word unethical when it comes to the voluntary markets because it implies ill intent. And it is not so because most of the players in the voluntary markets are and have a genuine interest in helping the planet and combating climate change. Yes, voluntary carbon markets are relatively new, and processes such as accounting, etc., need to be, and verification, etc., need to be updated with the growing size of markets. But I think it's also good that the media scrutiny will add to that process, and it'll accelerate such improvements to ensure the creation of better and more sophisticated standards. To sum it up, I think that the key evolutions in carbon markets for the coming decade should largely be the development of more sophisticated, regulated compliance markets that allow for interoperability between international targets, national, regional carbon markets, etc. And when it comes to voluntary markets, better monitoring, verification, and standardization processes. Before we conclude, I think that we've got a few questions. Let me start off with the first one, which is the enforcement of RPO in India is shoddy. Is the government thinking of this scheme very differently? Yes, we did touch upon this during our first session. We did have, I think that whoever's asked this question should also go back and check our first session, because I think we kind of delved fairly deep into what the provisions are right now and how is it being implemented, etc. But I think that Amoolya would love to kind of answer this question more than I would.
Uh, yes. So shoddy enforcement, very aptly put. So before we get into the question, just in terms of some background, what the RPO is, it's a renewable purchase obligation. It's an obligation on certain entities, mostly discoms and captive consumers, to procure a certain percentage of the energy that they procure from renewable energy sources. Now, enforcement has been shoddy, yes, due to several reasons. Um, the RPOs which were set by states, they were not uniform. They didn't take into account the specific situation or circumstances of a state. There are weak penalties, weak enforcement, um, little to no monitoring, no reporting requirements. There are also delays. There were also delays in target setting and revision of those targets. But all of this is a byproduct of the fact that the RPO has and never will be a central system. It's always been a state thing. RPO targets are now being set on a central level by the MOP, I believe. But as a system in itself, it's always been more applicable to state entities like discoms, which don't have the greatest financial health. The penalties were never strong, and recovery of those penalties was also not effective. Now, on the other hand, when you look at the carbon credit trading system, which we don't know too much about because detailed regulations are not available, but what we understand about it as a whole is that it's going to be a centralized system. It will basically, you're going to enforce it as obviously a central level. You are also essentially covering more than just the energy sector. You're covering a wide variety of probably manufacturing entities, hard to abate sectors, cement, steel, aviation, and a lot of other things. So what is the idea between the CCTS? It's a system where you're bringing in a carbon market. You're offering flexibility to industries to meet their emission reduction targets, mostly compliance entities, but voluntary entities are also being included here. Now, the government is clearly thinking of this very differently from the way that it's thought of the RPO. It is enforcing it at a central level. There are going to be robust monitoring and reporting obligations. Measurement will be done very, very well. There will be a lot of penalties, higher penalties than probably what the RPO already has. And when you breach your emission targets, it's not just going to be a financial penalty or a monetary penalty, but you can also be asked to buy allowances from the market. Now that is good because you can the options available to you to meet a shortfall is that you can always go to the market, which will the price will always be dynamic, and it also encourages other entities to set up projects and then sell to these people and also gain revenue in that way. So right now, like I said, we don't have too much detail on the CCTS, but we will cover this in our third session, which will be the next one.
Offsets are considered offsets only for their own project, or can the steel plant invest in an RE plant elsewhere? So under the offset approach, you can definitely invest in an RE project elsewhere to adjust for the emissions from your baseline. So the steel plant has no restriction from investing in an RE project elsewhere, right? Because it's not limited to that product or that activity which causes emissions. Like I said, offset is reducing greenhouse gas emissions from one activity or one project so that emissions or emitting activities can be undertaken elsewhere. That is what the offset mechanism is based upon solely. So there is no restriction. You could invest, you could develop an RE plant, you could just purchase carbon credits from secondary market or from the developer directly, and continue the manufacturing of steel in the way that it is done right now. And this is actually, sorry to slightly deviate from the topic, this is honestly one of the most mostly discussed topics when we attend, like say the India Energy Week or some other seminars where community is worried about replacing their existing technology to, purchase or to do their bit about carbon offsets, etc., because their existing technology is in a way carbon emitting technology. So the investment required, the capital required to replace that entirely is huge. And is that the commitment that they are willing to do, or is there another way? Offset allows that another way for you to, invest in an RE project elsewhere, like rightly said in this example. And I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Janvi. And just to add to what Janvi said, I think that, we've seen instances as well. I think all of the large, like you mentioned, the large players in the market, the large oil and gas players in the market have kind of realized the fact that they need to kind of invest elsewhere, and they kind of offset it by kind of creating other RE projects or carbon offsetting projects across the world. Again, some of these are also the questionable ones, which I mentioned earlier, where there have been afforestation aspects which have been, projects which have been done, and there are questions around it. But nevertheless, I think that all of the larger emitting players do understand that it is either that they create internal systems to reduce carbon emissions, or they find alternative projects where they are able to invest to kind of get carbon offsets. And I think, I don't know if you're touching upon that in the next session, maybe not, but that's something that we can probably take offline. But there are virtual PPAs. There are various things that can be done to kind of do all of that, right? I think there was one last question which came in, which I'll just quickly address. And this is a question on, a very pertinent question on, can carbon markets help generate additional revenue or affect the financial performance of companies? Answer, yes, absolutely. Where you are in a compliance market, you do need to kind of figure ways to kind of ensure that you are not, you're not required to pay a penalty. And so therefore, you do need to kind of do it. It may not generate additional revenue in that instance necessarily, but it would reduce additional costs because it's a compliance market. But in the voluntary market, I think all of the alternative energy players who are able to kind of, like all of the renewable energy projects, or if there are projects which are green projects where they have the ability to get carbon offset credits, they are able to additionally generate revenue. For example, the example that Janvi took, which was sale of carbon offsets, which was sold by a biodigester plant in Punjab, which sold off to a large oil and gas company, right? So you are able to kind of generate additional revenue as well. The other aspect is that you need to keep in mind that the world is transitioning into a more ESG focused approach. It is a matter of time before which that is going to become a compliance requirement. It's going to be, while it's there, you would see it in listed companies and the requirements to report it. While it's not absolute, I think that it will become, over a period of time, an accounting entry. And it will kind of impact profitability. It will impact various other things in some form or the other. Because I think all governments and all regulatory authorities are realizing the importance of this. Across the investor community, you would have seen that most investors have also kind of moved to what they call as ESG. I think that probably 3-4 years back, ESG was just an acronym where it was cool to use it with an investor. Not anymore. Investors are actually kind of monitoring it and looking at what ESG initiatives are there, and in that environmental, social actions which have been taken, and sustainability is one of them. So those are the questions. I don't think there are any other questions. So we conclude with that. We do have one session left. Like we mentioned, the last session is going to be on the Indian carbon market. While we've we started off with what exists, we've kind of covered carbon markets in the second session, and we've kind of told you what the examples are. We are going to look in detail into the carbon credit trading scheme, the discussion around banning of exports of carbon credits till our NDCs are achieved, a very controversial topic, and a lot of people have issues about it. But yes, let's discuss it and let's understand the pros and cons of it. Trading on exchanges and policy measures that are being adopted to strengthen the current regulatory framework. Thank you, everyone. That's our contact details, but please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to kind of engage with you on any questions that you have. And I think that we'll see a lot of action over the course of the next 4 to 5 years on carbon credits, and we will see it similar to what you see as in the financial market or the commodities market, and we think that that's where the carbon market will be at some point of time. Thank you very much again, and we'll see you for our next session.
Thank you.